All right, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us with regard to our press briefing on what the state is doing to slow the spread of coronavirus here in our state. And this is part of our series on back to school that we announced a few weeks ago to talk about the steps schools are taking to get kids back in classrooms for this fall. Before we get into that, I just want to remind people, of course, about our social distancing guidelines. When you're out in public, keep that 6 foot of distance between you and other people. If you can't do that, wear a mask. If you're, like, for example, if you're going to go to the store, that's a great opportunity to be able to do that. Wash your hands often for 20 seconds at a time. And then also, if you see a crowded bar or restaurant, that's a great opportunity to go to a different bar or restaurant, again, avoiding those large crowds. So all those are great rules for us to be able to use as we continue to manage this virus that, again, it's a virus. We can't stop it from coming, but we can continue to take steps to be able to slow it. And the whole point of why we are working on all these social distancing guidelines is to be able to preserve our hospital capacity. And we have successfully done this through the months of this pandemic. We today have our hospital capacity at 40% of our beds are available, 41% of our ICU beds are available, and 83% of our ventilators are available. So again, we've been successful. I want to remind people, please continue to practice the good social distancing guidelines we have with regard to making sure you keep that 6 foot of distance, wear a mask when you go to the store, wash your hands, all that sort of good stuff. Also, another great way that every Nebraskan can participate in fighting the spread of the coronavirus is by signing up for testnebraska.com and filling out a health assessment. If you do that, you can go start looking for a test to get scheduled. We've opened it up to everybody to be able to get a test to get scheduled. An example of how you might want to use that, say you're going to go visit relatives and you'd like to be able to get tested to make sure that you are coronavirus negative before you go see your grandparents, as an example. That would be a great opportunity to be able to use Test Nebraska to be able to do that. So sign up for testnebraska.com and you can start looking to get scheduled. And on that topic, we are looking to be able to expand the capacity at testnebraska.com. Now, first of all, here in Lincoln, we had been at North Star High School with school beginning. We're moving to Gateway Mall. That started on Saturday, and we have 500 slots available here in Lincoln Monday through Saturday. So now it's a Gateway Mall, so please, when you get signed up, get your scheduling slot. Make sure if you're here in Lincoln that you're paying attention to it's going to be at Gateway Mall. In Omaha, we on Saturday opened up the new Oakview Mall location for doing Test Nebraska as well. So we'll have the facility, the capacity at Crossroads, which is actually going up to about 1,600 slots a day. And then we will now be opening up Oakview Mall and ultimately looking to get that up to 1,600 slots a day as well. So again, great opportunity if you're in Omaha to either look at the Crossroads location or the Oakview Mall location. And of course, for the past several weeks, we've been working with other healthcare providers around the state to be able to provide Test Nebraska. Generally, they're doing it on certain days. So check, again, that Test Nebraska website for a location in your local area if you're not in Omaha or Lincoln. So again, great opportunities there to sign up for testnebraska.com. Great way to be able to help us continue to manage the virus here in our state. We also had a new single-day record for swabbing people of 3,791 swabs of people for Test Nebraska. So great continuing to see expansion there. Now I wanted to get on to talking about our back-to-school program here with regard to K through 12 education. As our guest today is going to be Commissioner Blomstedt, who's our Commissioner of Education. And as we've said in the weeks preceding this, that it's really important that we get kids back in classrooms. Some kids learn really well in remote environments. Some kids don't do as well in that remote environment. And so it's important for us to make sure that we're continuing the academic progression of all of our kids. I talked to a special needs mom, and she was talking about this as well. Special needs kids often have to do that in person to get that academic progression to continue. So it's really important from an academic standpoint. But it's not just about academics either. It's about a variety of different topics. It's about socialization, making sure kids can see other kids. It's about physical health, the physical health that goes on in schools. It's about mental and behavioral health. Again, making sure that kids are getting that attention from that standpoint. And many kids receive behavioral health services through their schools. It's about nutritional. We know that many kids meet part of their nutritional needs in school. So there's a wide variety of things that go into the overall health of a child when it comes to why it's important that they're back in the classrooms. And this is why our superintendents have been working so hard to be able to put together plans to be able to do that, and Commissioner Blomstedt is going to talk a little about that. I think you're going to talk about Dr. Grover's plan for Grand Island, which I heard a little over a week ago. Very impressed with the thoughtfulness that's being put into that plan. I also want to just read some quotes here about this from Dr. Robert Redfield at the Centers for Disease Control that he made in some remarks last week. Because we're talking about, it's not just about having kids back in classrooms for academic reasons. There's other reasons why you want to have this kids in classrooms as well. Because there are other costs that occur if kids are not in classrooms. And he specifically, and I'm reading a quote now, said, but there has been another cost that we've seen, particularly in high schools. We're seeing, sadly, far greater suicides now than we are deaths from COVID. We are seeing far greater deaths from drug overdose that are above excess that we had as background than we are seeing from the deaths from COVID. So this is why why I keep coming back for the overall social well-being of individuals. He went on to say, but I think that's important when talking about school-age kids and the risk to school-age kids as they go back to school, looking at the fatalities that we had by age group, that school-age kids were relatively being less impacted. I think at the time he said this last week, there was some 35 kids who were school-age that had passed away, and of course every death is tragic, but what he was trying to do is keep the risk in mind for everybody. He said, but I think that it's important because what that means actually is the risk per 100,000 so far, into the outbreak, 6 months into it, is in fact that we're looking at about 0.1 per 100,000. So another way to say that, it's 1 in a million. Now, I'm not trying to belittle that. I'm just trying to make sure that we look at, again, this is Dr. Redfield continuing to quote, I'm not trying to belittle that. I'm just trying to make sure that we look at it proportional. Because if you do the same thing for influenza deaths for school-age children over the last 5 years, they're anywhere from 5 to 10 times greater. So again, he's talking about the risk of coronavirus deaths versus the risk of flu, the regular flu deaths, and it being 5 to 10 times greater for school-age kids for the regular flu. So I want people to understand the risk properly as they make that decision. So again, the reason I read those quotes from the Centers for Disease Control is to really emphasize that we have to think broadly about the importance of having kids back in classrooms and all the reasons why it's important that kids are back in classrooms. And of course, parents ought to work with their principals, their superintendents, their teachers, with regard to their individual family needs. So for example, if you have a child who has some underlying health conditions, it may be very important then that you use a remote learning option for that child. But I think, again, it really gets back to each family having that conversation with their superintendents, their principals, their teachers, with regard to how they can have their kids back in the classrooms. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and now turn it over to you, Commissioner Blomstedt, to talk a little bit more about K through 12 schools and some of the plans you've been working on with your superintendents.
Well, thanks once again, Governor. And obviously, in these moments, there's kind of an increasing feeling of angst about where we go forward and how we go forward to do this together. And I really wanted to share really the work that I think we've been sharing all along, the intentional work that's been taking place in schools, at the Department of Education, with local public health, all of our consulting partners that are part of this, to ensure the best and safest environments that can be created. And I'll kind of talk through that, but I wanted to share a few of the foundational values that we had outlined with Launch Nebraska from the very beginning. Number one, equity, that we want to ensure that students, especially those who have been historically underserved, maintain access to high quality teaching. That's really important. And so in the balance of things, it's important that we're able to do that. And we want quality. While flexibility and innovation have to be continuously pursued, we don't want to step down from that quality. And so it's important that we find ways to continue to improve on the educational opportunities for our students. We want flexibility, and obviously that's this moment in time just requires that flexibility to be able to move forward. And some of that flexibility has to be given from the Department of Education to our schools, to work with them to ensure that they can both manage the safety of students and staff, as well as manage the importance of keeping an educational system moving forward. And we'll do that. We continue to do that with our schools and talk about the rules and regulations that we can provide flexibility around. And I do appreciate the governor has given us, when needed anyway, the opportunity to actually engage with him on those fronts too. And then safety. Obviously, safety in these moments of time is absolutely critical. And so why it's important to have schools build their safety plans with their local conditions, with their local health providers, with their local health officials overall, to ensure that that's coming together. And so we're looking for those things in the plans that schools have done. And then being decisive. And I think this is the hardest part for folks to understand, that superintendents and leaders and school boards and myself and the governor, we have to be able to take these steps forward. If we say an indecision and we're not able to move us forward and not thoughtful about those processes, we will be in a very tough spot for a long time. And I think this opportunity gives us a chance to be able to walk forward together and make those tough decisions. Also knowing that when we make tough decisions and we find out it's not the right direction, that we're able to adjust and move forward with our plans accordingly. So we really asked schools to be thoughtful about understanding and analyzing risk. We actually kind of created this foundational ideals set for how they would do their planning. First of all, analyze their risk, right? Do that with local health officials, do that with state health officials, do that really together to understand what the community spread risk is, all those things. And we've used everything from the phases that the governor has used statewide, as well as with risk dials with local health officials, to really merge those two concepts together so we can quickly communicate about how much spread is happening in a given county or a given area or a given school district. And so that's been important. I'm really asking schools to identify and tailor their protocols based on these key principles. What is really going to be important, what these conditions are, making sure that comes together in an effective manner. And then really then plan around these protocols, engaging their staff, engaging their communities, engaging their parents, engaging their students in the planning for that safe return. It takes behavior change actually to re-enter this school year. That's something we've not experienced before, and opening schools right now relies on individual behaviors as much as it does on our collective behaviors. And then finally, really review and communicate, and then where you find challenges to replan, go back through those strategies and understand that you have to go through that and adjust as you need. And again, working with local health, working with schools, and working with everyone that we asked in the first place to be able to be part of that process. So really, when I look at that, the notion of local health departments, and what folks need to understand, there's a key decision tree that's taking place in every school across the state. The superintendents, the boards are having conversations about the level of risks. Principals at a building level are able to have those conversations. We're setting up the protocols again for the entry into the school environment. And local health officials will be part of that process. They're helping with the risk dials. They're helping to understand the community level risk. They're helping with the protocols at a building level. They're helping at every stage of this. And so it's really been a critical set of partnerships that make that possible. Our local school districts have been actually remarkable. And as the governor mentioned about superintendents, probably the toughest time in education, probably in any of our lives, relative to understanding what's best for students. It's hard to balance between the safe environment that dealing with the pandemic while also understanding the impacts of not having school operating. Balancing those things is absolutely critical, and that's the hard work that superintendents and school leaders have been doing across the state, and I find that remarkable. The Department of Health and Human Services has been remarkable as well. Dr. Antone's here, but the reality of gauging and understanding what the level of risk is around the state and informing the governor, informing me, informing all the necessary partners so we can do that well has been a key part of that process. And then obviously with the Department of Education, as I've talked before, our importance of guiding schools on those key principles around education. We have to do the best by our students in this moment in time, and that's our intention. And when we have these very tough dialogues about what safety and not safety of students and the balancing act if they're not in school, as the governor mentioned, that's a critical decision and one that we do not take lightly at all. And then finally, our partners, including like the University Med Center and partners that we've used to consult with us, including national experts from Opportunity Labs and others, have provided that console for us to be able to make these decisions. But these decisions rest with policymakers. These decisions rest with school districts. We've asked them to structure their decision-making process. These decisions rest with local health officials on certain levels where they're able to do that. And some of these decisions obviously rest with the governor at a statewide level and myself, and working together is how we're going to get through this. And I find it really actually remarkable that we sit in this moment in time, we were all hopeful that maybe the trend lines would be better for the country than they are right now, but we're going to keep taking these steps forward in Nebraska. I'm absolutely convinced that we'll be able to do that and do that well. And we have a set of really thoughtful partners as we continue to go forward. I know that our school districts have done just such remarkable work that I have to give you a little bit of an example. Grand Island Public Schools released a plan on July 8th, I believe, and outlined a very thoughtful approach to this. And one of the things that I really appreciated within their plan was really kind of a message to parents and students and staff even, and saying, and I'll read a couple of the statements that they have. I acknowledge what's working today may not work tomorrow. Right? And this is one of the things that I think we have to get used to in this pandemic environment, that we're going to take steps and understand the environment and change when we have to, and everyone's going to have to be able to do that particular work. Another point that they put in place, I promise to take personal accountability for myself and others in order to maintain all safety protocols. As our students are entering buildings, maybe for the first time in quite some time, we actually have to do that kind of behavioral expectations and lay those out. We do that in schools already. We have expectations for how students interact and behave. And it's important that we give our schools that chance and that time to be able to build that back together, build ultimately those processes together. Our teachers that, especially, I would speak to our teachers that are concerned, right? They know how good they are at setting up those processes. It's going to take all of us doing that effectively as we keep going forward. And we know there's going to be struggles, and they mentioned some of that. The fact that we're going to have struggles, that we're really going to work on those things together. I know Dr. Grover, when she released this plan, had actually done a very thorough job of surveying her community. So some of the principles that we expected, surveying her community, asking them where they wanted to be at that point in time, at least 75% of their parents and families wanted to be in school physically, right? Some expressed some desire to have some type of remote learning, and others weren't quite sure yet. And so as they've gone through their planning process, they've laid out a sequence of opportunities for their students. So they've laid out what the expectations are in the school. They will wear masks in their school in Grand Island. They will expect that of their students. They will actually talk about lots of social distancing, and where social distancing is not possible, they've laid out a set of procedures that they want to make sure that that their students and staff are fulfilling. But they've also recognized that for students who can't be there due to health reasons, or parents or otherwise that want to choose a different option, they've provided that particular option. And they've done that with a thoughtful remote learning environment that they've built. They built a structure in place. They've worked with their teachers to ensure that they have the proper high-quality instructional materials and the approach that's going to be necessary to move them forward. And so I find that absolutely remarkable. They've laid it out as a kind of and I really do appreciate it because they've been thoughtful, but Grand Island Reimagined model, where the majority of their students are on site. They have a Grand Island Public School Select model where predetermined programs might be on site and other things are off site for certain students, and then their full remote model. And having all three of those options has been very, very thoughtful, and I'm very proud of their effort. What they also lay out is that it's important that they have key components to their effort. Number one, that group of students to be minimized to exposure for allow contact tracing. It's important that part of these plans understand that Keeping students in groups where you can contract trace as necessary is going to help us get back. Managing classroom environments to maximize social distancing, as we've talked about already. Requiring face coverings by all, and especially in moments in time where you can't guarantee 6 feet spacing. And everyone's talked about young kids and whether or not they can wear masks. And I see young kids wearing eyeglasses. I see young kids actually learning to understand how to be safe in environments. And it's important that we have those conversations. They're going to conduct daily screenings and temperature checks. I think that's critical. They're going to provide aggressive hand washing schedules throughout the school day, enhanced cleaning protocols throughout the day, and then minimizing guests that come back and forth to the school. So, they continue to build their plan. I know even what they've laid out, they'll adjust as they need to, but they've worked with local health officials. They've worked with their staff. They've worked with their families. They understand what's best ultimately for them to be able to move forward. And we have other schools doing the same thing. So even though I highlight Grand Island right now, I know every school across the state has been having these conversations. And where they found gaps or holes, they're coming to us to look for ways that we can help do that work together. And when they come to us, I go to local public health officials, or I go to other officials. And we pull all of that together ultimately to move us forward as a state. So I really appreciate what's been going on across the state of Nebraska for our schools. I understand the fears and trepidations that folks may have as we walk forward. But as we do this together, we'll get a comfort level, right? We'll get a comfort level of how that's going to work in schools. We'll understand when cases may pop up in schools that we're going to address those. We've had a chance, quite frankly, even as we've seen activities start up, we've had, students in activities that may have come down positive, and we have protocols that are building as a result of that. And I think, some comfort, I think, as I've talked to even my own kid's pediatrician about what the threat is to children, what our concerns are, what the signs are. And we'll continue to gather up that information and be able to provide it for parents and students and families and the public at large. So thank you. I know I went longer than normal, Governor, and I have a tendency to go long on it anyway, but I appreciate very much the opportunity to share some of that with you today.
Well, thank you very much, Commissioner. And again, compliments to Dr. Grover on the plan she's put together that you outlined there. Very thoughtful, giving parents options. Again, this is exactly what I think we expect out of our policymakers in our school districts. So congratulations on that. I know that all your superintendents are working on similar plans. All right, so next, just want to remind people that if your job has been impacted or your income has been impacted by coronavirus, one of the programs we have out there is our Workforce Retraining Initiative that allows you to work with your community colleges to be able, for example, to get a certificate or take that next step in your education. These are scholarships to help pay for that. So if you're interested in that, you can go to getnebraskagrowing.nebraska.gov, getnebraskagrowing.nebraska.gov, and you can find out more information there, or you can contact your local community college. Part of the program is that we are helping community colleges with navigators or coaches or whatever we call them to be able to help students to be able to figure out what they might be able to do. So reach out to community college. There are scholarships available there. This is CARES Act money that was given to the state that we're using as part of our workforce retraining initiative. So getnebraskagrowing.nebraska.gov, or go to your community college and ask about it. Upcoming schedule. We have Wednesday, we will be talking about our Developing Youth Talent Initiative. We will be back here at 10 a.m. on Wednesday to talk about that. And then next week, Monday, we will have another back-to-school briefing. I believe we're going to have the private colleges and state colleges talk about their plans for this upcoming fall. Taylor, did we have questions that were texted in or sent in ahead of time?
Don Walton would like to know what you believe would be the impact of the state entering 2021 without a business incentive program.
So Don Walton from the Journal-Star wants to know, what do I think the impact of entering 2021 without a business incentive program relative to our competitiveness to be able to attract businesses here. So a little bit of background on that. Our current incentive program, the Nebraska Advantage, expires at the end of this year. And so for us to be able to continue to have incentive packages, to be able to offer companies to come to the state, we would have to get that renewed. That's LB 720 is Senator Coulterman's bill to be able to do that. And so first of all, I think this is a great opportunity to be able to talk about how important it is that the legislature move on getting property tax relief and the incentives pulled together in this legislative session so we can get that done, get the people's business done here Property taxes continue to be the number one issue that people talk to me about as we go around the state. And then getting to Don's question about incentives. You know, incentives are a way that they're really kind of table stakes for us to attract companies to think about investing here in Nebraska or expanding their operation here. So every state has an incentive program to be able to do this. You know, ultimately, at the end of the day, we want to attract companies because we've got a great workforce, because we've got a great pro-business environment here. They're going to be successful here because of those things. But incentives are one of the ways that we help get people to take a look at our state. And many of the site selection companies and consultants that are out there advising companies look for these incentive programs where they don't even consider you as a spot that they'll recommend to their clients. So it's important that we get this all pulled together with property taxes and incentives and get that past this legislative session. If we did not get that done, that would put our state at a significant competitive disadvantage a significant competitive disadvantage in 2021 if we were not able to talk to companies about the incentives they could receive for coming here. Okay.
Julie Anderson says a couple doctors at the university are recommending the school should open when new cases are 50 per million or less per day. Do you have any comment on that?
So Julie Anderson from the Omaha World Herald is saying some doctors at UNMC, is that what I heard, are recommending that schools shouldn't open unless cases are at 50 per million per day. And what do I think about that? You know, I guess I would say, at the end of the day, policymakers, I think this is consistent with what you were saying, Commissioner, policymakers need to make these decisions, because when doctors say that, they're only looking at the very, very narrow part of the coronavirus part. When we as policymakers look at this, we have to look at the bigger picture. So I talked about Dr. Redfield and some of his comments with regard to how the CDC looks at this, with regard to things such as suicide rates, drug overdose deaths. We have the things about nutritional, behavioral health, physical activity. These are the broader picture things that we as policymakers have to make a decision on. And while we want to take advice from all sorts of different sources, at the end of the day, policymakers have to make that decision about getting kids back in school, looking at the broader picture. And specifically, when you're talking about 50 cases per day, let's just talk about that. Let's talk about, say, Papillion La Vista. If they were to use that specific thing, that would mean there would have to be less than 2 cases per day. And that means if a couple came home and they say they'd been traveling and they came back and they both had coronavirus, we're going to shut school down because one couple tests positive. I think part of the problem when you're using some of these things like 50 cases per million, you're talking about what works for large populations, but doesn't necessarily work when you're talking about applying them on a smaller population scale. This is where policymakers need to work with, in particular, superintendents, school boards, teachers, principals, need to work with their local public health department and look at the bigger picture and apply what they know with regard to the best overall healthcare interests are and to having kids in classrooms. And again, I think if you go look at the CDC, I didn't read this part of the quote, but Dr. Redfield said having kids in classrooms is a public health issue, that the health of these kids being in classrooms is a public health issue. So we want to keep that bigger picture in mind as we talk about this.
We have a question from Margaret at the Journal Star. She says, given the importance of getting kids back to school, why are you opposing mask mandates in Lincoln, Omaha?
So Margaret says, given the importance of getting kids back into classrooms, why do I oppose mask mandates in Lincoln and Omaha? And again, this gets back to masks are one tool that we use to be able to slow the spread of the virus. They're not the only tool. And it's a good tool. And so we encourage people to use it. We want to educate people on the appropriate use of using a mask. So for example, as we started off this press briefing talking about, if you're going to go to the store, wear a mask. If you're going to be inside where you cannot keep that 6 foot of distance between you and other people, that's a great time to wear a mask. So it's a tool that we want to have used in the appropriate way. When some of the school districts, and we were just talking about Dr. Grover's plan, to have kids in classroom wear masks, makes a lot of sense, right? Because again, that fits that criteria we were talking about with masks, which is if you're going to be inside, closer than 6 feet to somebody, wear a mask. That's going to fit the profile of a lot of classrooms. So Dr. Grover is actually applying the mask there in a very appropriate way for her students in the classrooms. However, we want to have people adopt this in their everyday life as part of what we do to manage it. And that's how we've approached this throughout this entire pandemic. Remember that we didn't put a mandate that people had to stay home. We asked people to stay home during our Stay Home, Stay Healthy, Stay Connected campaign. And guess what? Nebraskans did the right thing. They're community-minded. They did the right thing. So we want to educate, we want to communicate, we want people to know when using that tool of the mask is appropriate and have them adopt that as part of their everyday life. But at the end of the day, I don't want to make it a crime, which is what it is. If you pass an ordinance or something like that, you're now making a crime that somebody's not wearing their mask. And that's not, that heavy hand of government is not, I believe, the best approach to be able to get people to adopt using masks as part of their everyday life.
That's all I have now.
Great. All right, questions from inside. Joe?
Okay, there's a perception that I'm hearing, both from educators and parents, that we're going to reopen the schools, and this would be primarily in metro areas. And as soon as we start to see any sort of spread coming up in the schools, we're going to shut down, within a week or two. There's a skepticism that we can make this happen. Can you speak to the indicators that you're going to be looking for, that the health officials are going to be looking for, as far as tracking the cases? Because as was previously talked about, there are these thresholds out there, which if we abide by some of these thresholds, then this perception is likely to be true. We would see the schools shutting down.
So Joe's question is, there's a skepticism out there that the schools will be able to remain open once they open up. And to me, that gets back to, again, parents and teachers and principals and superintendents working together with the local public health officials with regard to what their plan is to be able to open. So for example, if you believe that masks and social distancing work, then you believe that you should be able to open up a classroom, right? And there are certainly going to be the likelihood that somebody comes down with coronavirus, and schools are putting protocols in place to address that. So they're already putting that as part of their planning for how they address it. Now, does that mean that there may not be individual cases where schools close down? Maybe, but we do that for the flu already. So if you look at history where we've had a school who's had a big flu outbreak, sometimes they've closed those as well. So I think this is part of, again, managing this virus for the long term. We got to think about the bigger picture of this. There may never be a vaccine. And so we can't shut down schools permanently, right? We know kids got to get educated. So now we have to learn how we're going to manage this in schools. So, for example, when the commissioner talks about the plan of Dr. Grover on how to manage it, that's a very well thought out plan for how we do this. And again, it's a plan that she worked on with her parents, with the local public health director, and that's the way we need to approach all this stuff. And Commissioner, at that, I'll ask you to come up and see if you have anything you wanted to add on to some of these concerns out there about opening up schools and then having some cases and having the schools closed down.
Yeah, and there's obviously a lot of conversations and efforts underway to kind of set up protocols that would happen. And I know that our local health districts, they've really outlined, again, when you do have a case in school, the likelihood of spread if students are social distancing and wearing masks is much less. And so really the protocol is, if there is a student that comes down or is tests positive, they're going to look and do the contact tracing with the school district. They're going to look and understand that level of risk. They're actually then going to be in an environment where they're going to say, well, does that mean we need to maybe have a set of students go home because we think they were in close contact, so you can reduce that risk of further spread. Obviously, the importance of testing along the way as they come up with that. But the contact tracing, I think, is a big part of it. I think the other part is really what the governor talks about, us being in an environment where the whole school gets shut down for maybe an incident isn't necessarily the concern. And I think what I heard the question from Joe here was hey, look, maybe if it's widespread in a school, obviously that would be a different circumstance. So I think situationally, each one of those situations is going to have to be addressed addressed. The one thing, and I think the governor and I probably both agree, heck of a lot easier to make decisions just to shut down schools than to open them, right? And so this notion of how we're going to manage through that environment, I'm concerned that if schools just have a few cases and shut down and don't think about all the ways to mitigate that we'll have a very hard time being able to be in school. And again, if the Grand Island example is a good example of where parents want to make sure their kids are in school, that they're able to function through work, that we're able to address the social emotional needs of students, we're going to have to be working on each one of those protocols. And I will just tell you and guarantee you that schools are thinking about that constantly and coming up with protocols to do that.
Thank you, Commissioner, and I'll just build upon that because I think you're exactly right when you're talking about the testing and contact tracing. We've been working on building up very robust contact tracing as well as testing, and this is where we're training up 1,000 people to be able to do contact tracing, so we can do that all very quickly. And I'll just use an example that we've had some already. For example, we had a girls' basketball team that was doing some conditioning, but they were keeping 15 feet apart. One of the young ladies came down with coronavirus, and so the public health official determined that nobody else had to quarantine because they were following those social distancing guidelines. So again, if we're following the social distancing guidelines, trying to keep that 6 foot of distance, wearing a mask where we can, it should really mitigate some of the instances where if somebody does test positive, that will spread. So again, I think that it gets back to the plans that the schools are putting together. Andrew.
How much more pressure did you put on Omaha and Douglas County that you didn't do on Lincoln? Kind of have a tale of two cities on how they approach the mask mandate.
So the question from Andrew was, how much more pressure did I put on Omaha versus Lincoln? And we didn't put any different kind of pressure on either one of the cities. We walked through the specifics of their cases with regard to what the law said and then let them make that decision.
And now you have a pool owner challenging Lincoln.
Excuse me?
You have a pool hall owner challenging Lincoln's mask mandate. I mean, what's your reaction to that? I mean, will you step in at all in this particular case?
So Andrew said, well, now you have a pool hall owner here in Lincoln who is challenging the mask mandate. I'm not familiar with the details of that. But this is, again, one of the things that I'm concerned about is that when you start putting mandates in place and having the force of law, that it changes the dynamic versus soliciting people's voluntary compliance with doing things such as wearing a mask when you're inside. So that's why we've taken the approach of trying to educate people on the appropriate use of masks, similar to what we did with the stay-at-home order, where we asked people to stay home, and take that approach. Obviously, they've done a different approach here in Lincoln, and since I don't know the specifics of this lawsuit, I really can't comment any further with regard to what the state may or may not do.
They're not going to arrest him. They're going to take it to civil court and continue to fine him for every day he doesn't comply, with this particular order. I guess, you said that you were looking at legal opportunities or what your legal options were with Lincoln. I mean, how serious are you about actually doing anything against Lincoln or Omaha if they decide to pass the mask mandate?
So the question was again about what's the state going to do with regard to this case and the legal basis with which Lincoln is acting. And again, we will act to make sure that Lincoln is following the law, and if Lincoln's following the law, then they can continue to pursue it, and that's the same thing with regard to Omaha as well. We just ask that they got to make sure that they're following the law, and if they're following the law, then they will be able to pursue the courses they're pursuing. Joe.
Yeah, did you pressure Audipor to back off on the Douglas County mask mandate?
So the question was, did I pressure Audie Moore to back off on the Douglas County mask mandate? We had several conversations with Dr. Poore with regard to the reasons why or why not to do a mask mandate. So much of the same conversations we've had here with regard to our philosophy. We talked about the data. And then we did have a team that included my office and the Attorney General's office walk through with Audie why we didn't believe she actually had the authority to be able to issue a mask mandate. And so we just wanted to make sure that Dr. Poore had all the information available to her as she made that decision, but ultimately the decision was hers with regard to whether or not she was going to pursue a mask mandate.
Governor, you talk about local control, but then they made it seem like they were prepared to have the state of Nebraska take legal action against the Douglas County if they were to go forward with a mask
So the question was, when you're talking about, it looked like the state was prepared to go forward with legal action on a mask mandate if you just said Dr. Poor had the choice to go forward. And the answer is because you still got to follow the law, right? So if you are not following the law, then we are going to pursue that. So if you set it up in a way that is legal for you to be able to pursue it, we don't have, then we're not going to have a problem with that. But if you are not following the law, then we are going to pursue that. And that's really what we were laying out for Dr. Poor, is why we believe she did not have the legal authority to do that. Yeah,
I guess
Andrew.
going back though, if you haven't done anything to Lincoln, why should Omaha worry if they're going to do anything to Omaha?
Well, again, it has to do with, the question was, if you didn't do something in Lincoln, why would you do something in Omaha? And it gets back to the specific facts and circumstances of how the law applies in one place versus another versus what they were planning on doing.
So you would go after Omaha if they imposed the mask mandate?
Again, so the question was, you would go after Omaha if they impose a mask mandate. And again, it gets back to how they do it. So for example, with Dr. Poor, we did not believe she had the legal authority, and if she moved forward, we would challenge that in court. Yeah, Joe.
Do you believe that the schools across the state are prepared to open? Or that the next week is the big week? We're going to start school somehow, some way. So can you address that?
Do I believe schools are prepared to open? And absolutely, schools are prepared to open to have kids back in classrooms. And it gets back to, for example, the plan we just talked about with Dr. Grover and the Grand Island schools. We use that as one example of one of the school districts and the thoughtful planning that has gone into having kids back in school this fall. And that's a great model, and why I'm confident that schools are prepared to have kids back in classrooms. Yeah, Andrew.
A question from Matt, actually, maybe both of you. I mean, I guess what have you heard about how many parents have wanted to go remotely, requests to do remotely? How many requests have you gotten from teachers that they're going to either retire or early, or they're going to ask for special, leave or special remote learning type of opportunities?
So Andrew's question was, how many families have said they'd like to have remote learning opportunities, and how many teachers have asked for accommodations with regard to their personal needs? So I'll use the example with Dr. Grover. My understanding is, or my recollection was from when we heard her present about a week and a half ago or so, I think about 13% of the families in Grand Island requested to be able to do the remote learning. I think you said about 75% said they wanted to be in the classroom, and the rest were kind of somewhere in the between. And then I don't have the specific numbers with regard to teachers, and maybe Commissioner you do, but just in general, I think that's part of what schools have to be thinking about is, look, you are going to have teachers with those underlying health conditions that you need to make accommodations for, to allow them to work remotely to be able to do their job. So again, I think this is where the schools have to put the plans in place, both from the families of the students and also for the teachers, to be able to make accommodations. And this, I know the word has been used a lot, unprecedented times. Nobody's been through a pandemic here in our country in over a century. So we do have to look to be accommodative to families and teachers with regard to that. And Commissioner, I'll let you say a few remarks on this too.
Yeah, and I think we basically, as the governor described, I mean, we see 15 to 20% of any population, whether it's students or even within teachers. That's been roughly the rule of thumb. And we've seen some national numbers. I don't have specific Nebraska numbers on that. Schools have really been trying to work with their teachers in that planning. And so I would really encourage, and if there has been concerns about that, I'd really encourage the teachers to be speaking with their administrators about what other precautions and mitigations would be necessary for them. And I know a lot of that's been taking place. I also know that everyone has a level of fear because they haven't experienced that environment yet. And as we're walking into that, taking an extra cautionary step, I think is important. We've seen some schools start to talk about maybe we'll put 25% of our students in the classroom with our teachers and really build those new normals in place for folks and be able to stair step up into that environment. It's important. We're seeing schools have those types of conversations about how they communicate with parents, the expectations of their students. And again, we're seeing that all over the state, but percentage-wise, I mean, I think that's a pretty typical percentage is kind of in that 15 to 20% that certainly have concerns about re-entering that environment.
Do you have a pool for student substitute teachers?
So the question was, do we have a pool for substitute teachers? That's actually a substantial concern, actually, for schools. That actually has been a concern pre-pandemic even, just the number of available teachers for the classroom environment. And so schools have been really looking at that, finding different ways to accomplish that. When we've talked about rule and reg flexibility, we have some things in rule and reg that allow for local subs. That's not quite the same expectations of that, including working with paras and others to be able to ensure that that environment's working. And as you raise that point, the concern to keep schools open is you have to keep the workforce in place. I mean, we have to have the adults there, right? And so if we have events that would put them in further harm's way or that level of risk, it's not going to be able to keep all the schools open either. And so it's a balancing act, I think, on all those fronts right now. It's always bad when all the hands go up, Governor.
Are these for the commissioner?
Yes.
Okay, Commissioner, you don't get off that easy.
Oh, I was trying. I thought it was his press conference. Okay.
So we heard about in-person remote learning options, how we're gonna try to play that into this, but has there been, discussions about even delaying the fall semester later into, I guess, September or October?
So the question was, there's a lot of talk about remote learning, but has there been conversations about delaying the semester until a later date? And there have been. I mean, over time, there definitely have been those particular conversations. I think more likely now for schools is they're really moving forward with their plans to enter and understanding if there are interruptions, but basically how do they do that? I know there's also a lot of conversations around fall sports and where we go with those fronts, and I know there's been conversations about whether or not there should be some delays there. At this point, that's not where the decision points are. But again, definitely have been conversations. But right now, I believe people feel like they can step forward. And I don't know who is next, but Joe.
Yeah, do you believe, and this could be for either of you, do you believe that there are enough trained contact tracers and enough rapid testing so that once the schools open, we can very quickly determine if a case comes up, if it's a valid case, and we can take action to isolate it?
So the question was, do we have enough testing and contact tracing to be able to accommodate the schools opening? And as I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, one of the reasons we're expanding the capacity at the Test Nebraska lab to be able to process more tests is in anticipation of kids being back in classrooms, whether it's the K through 12 classrooms or at our institutions of higher education. And so we are expanding that, and we are also working to make a really robust contact tracing program where we'd have up to 1,000 people just at the state level to augment the 218 or so that are trained at the local level to be able to do that contact tracing. So I'm confident that we will have both the testing resources and the contact tracing resources to be able to accommodate school openings.
We have a question from Erin Duffy at the World Herald. She says, you don't want to make mask mandates because it could be a criminal issue. She's saying that Lincoln is not enforcing their mask mandates against individuals. And do you think there's a way to do a mask mandate without using police enforcement?
So the question from Erin Duffy at the World Herald was, one of the reasons I'm not in favor of mask mandates is because it would be a criminal offense, it would be a misdemeanor. Lincoln is not enforcing that against individuals. Is there a way to do it where it's not an enforceable misdemeanor? And that is actually part of the rub. So if you don't enforce it, what are you teaching people? That it's okay to violate the law? I don't think that's a very good societal thing that we ought to be doing, is reinforcing that it's okay that if we have laws on the books, but you can violate those laws and they're not really laws, it's not really a penalty. So I think that's a wrong message to send to people that, yes, we have laws, but you can violate them at will. If it's not the mask mandate, why couldn't it be something else? The second one then is, well, can you do it in a way that isn't a law? And that's what we're doing, which is trying to educate and communicate and really help people understand when the best time to use a mask is, so they use it in an appropriate way. And make it part of what we do in everyday life to be able to manage the spread of the virus here. There isn't really an in-between there. You can't make a law, well, I suppose you could make a law, but have no penalty for it. But that's not the way that the state law works today. with regard to this. So one of the conversations we had with Dr. Poor, for example, is that if she, went forward and did her mask mandate the way she was planning on it, it would have the force of law. If I did it from the state level, if I did a directed health measure, it would have the force of law. That's the way the laws work today. So in absence of changing that, it either has to be a crime or you can't put it into law. Yeah, Andrew.
Another question on local control. Why, there's a hearing in the Government Affairs Committee today about allowing, I guess solidifying that only a governor's order can allow for local governments to hold virtual meetings or Zoom meetings. I mean, can you respond to that? Why is that important to keep it in the governor's control as opposed to allowing local governments to declare the emergency, to have such meetings?
So the question was about a hearing today, according to Andrew, that is looking at our public meetings law. And one of the things that I did early on in this pandemic is I waived a statute that allowed those public meetings to be held virtually so that, again, we could help manage the virus. And then I allowed that order to expire. And so now public meetings have to be held in person again so the public can have access to those public meetings. And it's at all levels of government. And so the question was, why does that need to be done at the state level? And I think that's to guarantee that the citizens of the state, under our Constitution, have access to those public meetings, because if our government officials are going to take actions, citizens need to be able to weigh in on those. It's engraved on this Capitol building, right? The salvation of the state is the watchfulness of the citizen. So we need to have citizens be able to weigh in and have the ability to do that. And if you can't do that, then you lose the effectiveness of citizen input into our government system, which is, of course, the foundation of our entire republic. So I do think it's important the state continue to protect that right of citizens to be able to oversee and hold accountable public officials at all levels through those Open Meetings Act. I mean, there's a reason why those Open Meeting Acts were passed, so citizens can sit on those meetings when it comes to budget time or big policy time to be able to give their input to those elected boards.
Time for just a couple more questions.
A couple more questions. Joe.
This is kind of along those same lines on public disclosure. When the school's open, parents and policymakers are going to be watching very closely for the spread and how things are going. How will parents and policymakers know how many cases are turning up in schools? What happens is typically with, say, influenza or norovirus, the schools will send an email home to the parents in that school, but they're not necessarily required to make a public disclosure to the rest of the community. How will that be handled? How should schools handle it when they get those cases?
So the question was, as we reopen schools and we have cases in the schools, how will parents and the general public know with regard to specific cases within those schools? And Commissioner Blomstedt, I presume this is part of the planning that schools are doing, so maybe I'll ask you to come up and address this.
Yeah, and one of the, obviously one of the challenges in dealing with pandemics is knowing every specific case and understanding that well. And so there are certain privacy rights, obviously, to individuals. But schools can report generally of cases that doesn't go back to an individual student and doesn't personally identify them. It's also working with local public health and the school districts on how to best manage that. And I think as in the question itself, I mean, the fact is the schools have done that with flu and other things. So in the aggregate or in numbers as they're reported, it could be reported. How schools are planning to handle that, obviously their biggest concern is communicating with the parents and the staff and those families. I think as we continue to look at that and how that's managed with public health, I'm going to have an interest as well of knowing where schools are at and whether or not that they're having to close given those particular cases. And so figuring out some of those reporting mechanisms is probably I would say ongoing ongoing because each one of the plans that they're doing with local health is part of that. And so, but I do think, and I understand the kind of the level of concern at the public at large. And as we see schools that might be impacted by COVID, understanding where it's happening, and it actually could be helpful actually as we track cases across the state too.
We've seen some of the worst case scenarios in the U.S. where we're having large outbreaks at places like summer camps, and people are saying that could be the example of what's going to happen at schools. What are local schools doing to learn or make sure that something like that isn't happening?
So Commissioner, actually, I'm going to have you take that one as well, because it has to do with some of the outbreaks at summer camps, and how does that apply to learnings for schools?
And I think I can remember saying this back in May, that we would learn a lot during the summer about what those safe conditions are. And we're actually learning from other places that have had these experiences. I think one recently on the summer camp was in Georgia, and you saw a substantial spread. And if you look at the specifics of that particular camp and what they didn't necessarily practice all of the things that we're asking that schools practice: social distancing, mask wearing. In fact, at that particular camp, they were singing and shouting like you might expect at a normal camp setting in the summer. Well, that's been proven to be kind of a concern for spread. And so when we have schools that are doing things, these dynamics of taking breaks and wearing masks, and when they might be able to do that, choirs and being thoughtful about that. We've released music guidance as a result of that for how schools should manage those things. Understanding what high-risk behaviors might cause spread is important. And so we continue to learn from those environments that we've seen in other places. And we'll continue to do that. As new information comes forward, we keep sharing that and having it shared by all of our different partners across the state. So that does help us learn from those environments and make improvements in our protocols.
One last question. Yes.
Okay, so there's a lot of pressure being put on teachers this year, and, a lot of teachers might have to change their teaching style, and, with some students working remotely, parents might be watching. So what happens when parents don't necessarily like the teacher's approach? Is the state prepared to back up on teachers who are working?
So the question was, as kids start learning, at least some of their learning may be done remotely, and therefore that means parents may be watching how the teachers are interacting with the kids. If the parents don't like the teaching style or whatever, what's the state going to do? And actually, I would say this is actually where the parents need to start with the conversation with the teacher, opening up that dialogue there, and then with the principals and superintendents. So there really isn't a role here for the state to get involved, but really something to be worked out locally with the parents and the teachers and the superintendents and the principals really working together to be able to figure this out. And again, just want to emphasize, we said this a couple of weeks ago when we were here, asking parents to be patient and, understand that this is something that we're all doing for the first time when we go through this. And so there are going to be lessons learned as we go through this, and we'll do things better as time goes on. And please be patient with the teachers as they go through this, because they're new at this too. So I would say it really needs to be a conversation with the parents and the teachers. Well, again, folks, thank you very much for spending time with us here today to talk about what the state is doing, in this case, to be able to give you that up-to-date back to school update on how we're going to have kids back in classrooms this fall. And as always, we want to wrap up by reminding people, please continue to do your social distancing guidelines. Keep that 6 foot of distance between you and other people when you're in public. Wear a mask when you go to the store. If you can't be that 6 feet away from other people when you're inside, wear a mask. Wash your hands often for 20 seconds at a time. If you see a crowded bar or restaurant, that's a great time to go pick a different bar or restaurant. These are all things that will help us be able to slow the spread of the virus. And of course, please consider signing up for testnebraska.com as a way to be able to help the virus as well here in the state. With that, thanks again, and we'll see you back here on Wednesday to talk about the Developing Youth Talent Initiative. Till then.